Hello health lovers, so welcome to the part 3 of the nervous system. So far so good, we have introduced the nervous system, dividing them into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So in today's video, we are still going to continue in the central nervous system, and we are going to be talking about the anatomy of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Now let's talk about the thalamus. Now the thalamus is an egg-shaped mass of gray matter. Now it's an egg-shaped mass of gray matter that is situated deep within the brain. The length of the thalamus is about 4 cm. Now you want to talk about the location of the thalamus, you have to go back to neurulation when we talk about differentiation of the brain. Remember the diencephalon. Now the thalamus originates from the diencephalon and it lies in between the cerebral cortex and the brainstem. Another name for the thalamus is known as the central gateway because all the sensory information, remember sensory information and the motor output, sensory information gets to the brain and the brain responds with motor output. So all the sensory information before getting into the cerebral cortex, it passes through the thalamus. That is why the thalamus is called the central gateway. Now the thalamus is composed of gray matter, as I said earlier, but it has a Y-shaped partition of white matter. Now this Y-shaped partition of white matter is called the internal medullary lamina. That is the Y-shaped pattern of white matter. Now let's talk about the parts of the thalamus. Now the part of the thalamus is otherwise known as the nuclei or nucleus of the thalamus. Now we have the anterior nuclei, we have the posterior nuclei, we have the ventral nuclei, we have the lateral geniculate body, we have the medial geniculate body, we have the reticular nucleus, and we have the pulvinar. So let's talk about the anterior nuclei. So let's talk about the anterior nuclei. So the anterior nuclei is connected to the limbic system. So when you hear the limbic system has to do with memories, emotions. So those parts of the brain that helps to control memories and emotions, they are all forming the limbic system. Now the next nuclei or the next part of the thalamus is the medial nuclei, the medial part. Now the medial nuclei is otherwise known as the dorsomedial nuclei. Now what is the function of the dorsomedial nuclei? It helps to regulate emotions, it helps in memories, and also helps in what? Thinking. That's to say it's part of what? The limbic system. Now the next one is the ventral nuclei. The ventral nuclei has series of nuclei under it. We have the ventral anterior nuclei, we have the ventral lateral nuclei, and the rest. So let's talk about the ventral anterior nuclei. Now this ventral anterior nuclei helps in movement. It helps the body in what? Movement. Now moving forward, we talk about the ventral lateral nuclei. Now the ventral lateral nuclei helps in coordinating the movement. When the anterior brings the movement, the coordination comes from the lateral. Now we talk about the ventral posterior-medial nuclei. Now this ventral posterior-medial nuclei helps to carry sensation from the face. Whatever facial sensation that you feel, it carries the sensation. Now the last one is the ventral posterolateral nuclei. Now this ventral posterolateral nuclei helps to carry sensation from all parts of the body. So those are the types of the ventral nuclei. Moving forward, we talk about the pulvinar. So the pulvinar is otherwise known as the posterior part or the posterior nuclei. Now this pulvinar helps to interpret visions, auditory, what we see and what we hear. Now moving forward, we talk about the lateral geniculate body. So this lateral geniculate body helps to receive visual information from the eyes. So we have the medial geniculate body that helps to receive auditory information from the ears. Now moving forward, we have the reticular body. Now you say the reticular nucleus. Now the reticular nucleus helps to regulate the thalamic activity. That's all these activities that I mentioned. And we also have the sleep-wake cycle. It helps to regulate sleep-wake cycle. That's tell you when to sleep, when to wake up, etc. Now we have the next thing, which is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, as we all know, is the major control center of the autonomic nervous system. So this autonomic nervous system has to do with controlling involuntary actions like heartbeats, etc. So it is the control center. Another name of the hypothalamus is called the head ganglion. Now the head ganglion means it supersedes every activity that takes place in the autonomic nervous system. Location of the hypothalamus. Where is the hypothalamus located? Now the hypothalamus is located in the base of the brain and it's in between the thalamus and the pituitary gland. So superiorly is the thalamus, inferiorly to the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. Now let's talk about the parts of the hypothalamus, or we talk about the gross structure. You can call it the gross structure of the hypothalamus. Now we have the anterior part, we have the posterior part, we have the medial part. Now let's talk about the anterior part. The anterior part of the hypothalamus is otherwise known as the preoptic area. Now this area is responsible for water balance, is also responsible for sleep regulation and thermoregulation. Now we go over to the medial surface, that's the medial part. The medial part is otherwise known as the tuberal hypothalamus. Now it's responsible for aggressiveness, hunger. It regulates hunger, the way you eat. It comes from the medial part of where the hypothalamus. Now we now have the posterior part of the hypothalamus. The posterior part of the hypothalamus helps in heat conservation. Heat conservation, how do we conserve heat? That is when you talk about the constriction of the blood vessels and the rest. So it helps in heat conservation and also helps in sleep-wake cycle. Now let's talk about the connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Now the hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland using two ways. We have the blood pathway and we have the neural pathway. Now the blood pathway connects to the anterior pituitary gland. You know that the anterior pituitary gland is called the adrenal hypophysis, so it connects it through the blood pathway. That is where the infundibulum stalk goes up. Now we now have the neural pathway. Now the neural pathway connects to the posterior part of the pituitary gland. I know that the posterior part of the pituitary gland is called the neural hypophysis, so it connects with the neural hypophysis. Now what is the functions of the hypothalamus? Now the hypothalamus helps in sleep-wake cycle. It helps to regulate hunger or control hunger. It also helps in emotions too. The hypothalamus helps to regulate all the endocrine activities because it's released two hormones. Now these two hormones that the hypothalamus releases is called the hypophysiotrophic hormones. Now these hormones is either inhibiting or releasing. So these hormones helps to regulate the endocrine activities. Now it has so many functions. It also helps in thermoregulation, heat conservation, etc. So blood supply to the hypothalamus is a circle of wheels. Now the circle of wheels, if you turn the brain upside down, there are four large arteries: the anterior cerebral arteries, the two lateral cerebral arteries, and the posterior cerebral arteries. They all empty into that middle. Now that middle is the circle of wheels. So the circle of wheels is responsible for the blood supply to the hypothalamus. Now we are done with the anatomy of the forebrain, so I am going to be talking about the anatomy of the midbrain. Now the midbrain is the shortest part of the brainstem and is the superior part of the brainstem. It's very short. Now location of the midbrain is located in between the forebrain and the hindbrain. Let's talk about the gross structure of the midbrain. Now the midbrain is divided into three parts. We have the tectum, we have the tegmentum, and we have the cerebral peduncles. Now let's talk about the tectum. Now the tectum is found in the posterior part. So the tectum is the posterior part of the midbrain. Now it is located behind the cerebral adjutant. It's located behind the cerebral adjutant. Now the cerebral adjutant is in front and is located behind. It has four rounded elevations. Now these four rounded elevations is known as the corpora quadragemina. Now this corpora quadragemina is now subdivided into two. That is when we have the superior and the inferior. Now the superior part is responsible for visual reflexes, while the inferior part is responsible for auditory reflexes. Now moving forward, we are going to talk about the next part of the midbrain, which is the tegmentum. Now the tegmentum is the center. So it is that center part that is found in front of the cerebral adjutant. That is the tegmentum, the center part that is found in front of the cerebral adjutant. So the last part of the midbrain is the cerebral peduncles. Now these cerebral peduncles are two nerve fibers that forms the anterior surface of the midbrain. So we are done explaining the midbrain and we are going to talk about the functions of the midbrain. Now the midbrain helps in conducting nerve impulses. It also helps in auditory reflexes. It helps in visual reflexes, and it also helps in movement, posture, etc. So this is the anatomy of the midbrain. So far so good. We have talked about the anatomy of the forebrain, citing the anatomy of the cerebrum, the anatomy of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and we have also talked about the anatomy of the midbrain. So see you in my next video. I am going to be talking about the anatomy of the hindbrain. That is going to be the brainstem. We are going to talk about the pons, the medulla, etc. So thank you very much for watching. Do well to like, share, and follow. Bye.